The glass cliff tells the story of what happens, unfortunately, all too often when that glass ceiling has been broken through. Often find that when they get the opportunity to step into high-profile leadership positions, that's generally in businesses that are experiencing some kind of moment of crisis. That part of the thinking behind that, whether consciously or unconsciously, is that women are viewed as more disposable in business. Women are viewed as more expendable. And that means that in these moments of crisis, as well as being able to be mother, and as well as being able to be that sort of cultural, look how good we are, they also make really good scapegoats.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I'd like to share with you a story that you probably have heard over and over again. I watched a show recently called Running Points, and the protagonist is played by Kate Hudson. And she's sort of the delinquent little sister in a big family and not doing much with her career. But when her eldest brother, who was in charge, OD'd and got into a car accident, she was asked to step up and take over the family business. So I think the story itself, it's sort of funny, but can you remember the times where you heard the same storyline over and over again? Let's think back to the last U.S. presidential election when President Joe Biden, when the Democratic Party found that maybe he's not the right candidate in the very last moment. Who did they ask to step up? It's Kamala Harris. And we see this over and over again during Brexit. Theresa May was asked to step up. And you see that in tech companies as well. Now, this is a phenomenon worth looking into because it really talks about a systemic issue that we're facing nowadays. So today I am very, very honored to have with me Miss Sophie Williams, the writer of the book, The Glass Cliff. Welcome, Sophie.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to having our conversation today.
Thank you so much, because when I saw this book, I thought, finally, someone's writing about this, because we see time and time again, women are asked, well, not even just women, people that are marginalized are asked to step up, or they only get the opportunity to step up and take over an impossible situation. And this book talks about why that happens and the complexity of the issue and what can we do about it. So can we please start off by saying, we've heard the glass ceiling, but we have not really heard the glass cliff. Can you tell us what that means?
And for a long time, even after I'd written the book and done the TED Talk and, had all of these touch points with it, I kept making the mistake and I kept calling it the glass ceiling because it's just so much more established culturally, right? Most people who are adults at this point have heard of the glass ceiling. But the glass ceiling we talk about as this invisible but limiting effect that sits above the heads of particularly women in business. And so the glass cliff recognizes that some people do manage to break through that glass ceiling. The glass cliff tells the story of what happens, unfortunately, all too often when that glass ceiling has been broken through. So as you alluded to in your introduction just then, what often happens is women and people from non-traditional leadership backgrounds, so that's anyone in the UK and in the West who isn't both white and male, often find that when they get the opportunity to step into high-profile leadership positions, that's generally in businesses that are experiencing some kind of moment of crisis. And that crisis can be like all sorts of things. It can be a financial crisis, it can be a reputational scandal, it can be a hit to market valuation, it can be all sorts of things. But what is always the case, what is much too often the case, is these people are only being turned to when there is a pre-existing problem that they either need to come in and solve, or they need to come in and become the figureheads of before being pushed out of the business, pushed over that cliff. And so it's really important to say, and I know that we'll come to it, every single woman who takes a leadership position doesn't face the glass cliff. And that's really good. It doesn't mean that if you're a woman, you should give up, you should limit yourself, you should, stop being ambitious. So not every woman will face the glass cliff, but everyone who faces the glass cliff is a non-traditional leader, like a woman or a racially marginalized man.
Why do you think that is? Because during a time of crisis, usually we think, well, you want a sure bet. So let's say the sure bet in a westernized society is white male, right? Why is it, do you think, during crisis, people aren't going for the sure bet? People are asking someone who hasn't really gotten a chance to prove herself to step up. Like, for example, the show that I just talked about, she has not clearly done a lot of leadership responsibilities, but she's asked to step up at that point.
I think it's really interesting that you sort of bring that up. And I think it is really important because it gives us the chance to frame the conditions that have to happen for the glass cliff to play out. So, like I said, not every woman who steps into every leadership position will face the glass cliff because there needs to be a certain set of factors at play. And these factors really let us know, one, that we're at risk, and they let us know what the perceptions are that lead to women being given these opportunities in these much more difficult to succeed circumstances. So the first reason that we see businesses turning to women when there is, some sort of large problem, some sort of long-term problem, is that it's perceived, it's expected that women will have more soft skills. Women will be softer, gentler, kinder. They can take a team, a workforce, a business that's gone through a hard time and essentially be mother. She can wrap them in her arms and tell them it's okay and help them emotionally get through that time. And we know that that is really valuable all of the time, but we know especially when a business has been through a hard time, people who are making those hiring decisions might be looking for someone who can have that softness, have that warmth, have that real people approach that's often lacking in traditional ideas of male leadership. And that's not to say that men or trans people or non-binary people can't exhibit these behaviors. I'm just saying that we're more socialized to expect them from female people.
Absolutely, because that's an archetype, right? When you think of women, you think motherly, you think warmth. These are the attributes we often see in women or expect from women.
Yes. Yeah. Or penalize women if they don't have enough of. There's this real expectation.
Exactly. So it sounds like when we're in crisis, it's like when you're hurt, you want to run to your mother, right?
Yeah.
But when you're strong enough, you think you're okay on your own, then you go back to the normal way, which is what we kind of see. And I did want to go back to talk about the glass ceiling part, because when I talk about this, I belong to Women on Board in Taiwan. And still, we're addressing issues on why there aren't as many women on the boards as they should be. There are so many qualified women. But when you bring up the concept glass ceiling, you're often met with resistance, not just from men, but women as well, saying, well, we don't want to see ourselves as victims, or you shouldn't see yourself as victims because there are so many female leaders out there already, right? It's equal playing field. Okay. So we hire based on meritocracy. Okay. And I think it's a conception that people struggle with in United States as well. There's Barack Obama as president, so there's no racism. And there's so many female leaders, so there's no sexism. So I think when we talk about glass ceiling, you still get people saying there's no glass ceiling, because I see female leaders out there. So can we elaborate a little bit on that? Just because they're a representation, you had a lot of very interesting statistics in the beginning of your book that demonstrates that we have not made as much of progress as we thought we've made. And I was very surprised to read that. Can you share some of that with us?
So yeah, that was something that I actually found really interesting when I was doing the research for the book, because I think so often we have this idea of this narrative of progress. We are in a society is always moving forwards and we're moving forwards with it. And that forwards we always expect to be better. That forwards we always expect to be making progress towards equality, making progress towards the values that so many of us believe are important. But when I was sitting down to write this book, which is my third book, I was also invited by the United Nations to be a delegate to the Commission to the Status of Women conference. And I will say that does sound cool, but it was COVID, so it was virtually. So I was at home doing it, but it was still fun to like feel like
Yeah.
you're in the room. And what really struck me was as I was sitting down to write this book about women and, the myth of meritocracy and the barriers that we face and all of these different things, I was expecting this conference, this time at the United Nations to be a real like galvanizing force. I expected it to be like a yes, okay, and we're powerful and we're doing it and like, girl power, Spice Girls, let's do this. But what I found was quite different. So in the year that I was there, the Secretary General started by giving a talk about how for years and years we were making progress, and now that progress has not only stalled but has reversed. And he's talking globally, and he's talking about the status and the position of women and girls in the world. But yeah, he's talking about how we still have this narrative that we are making progress, and we are so interested in that narrative. We're so wedded to that narrative. We're so proud of that narrative that we haven't necessarily taken the time to look and to think and to assess and to say, are we still making that progress that we're so proud of? And I was really surprised to hear him not only say that it has stalled, but it has started to go backwards. And we can see that in sort of conversations about things like women's reproductive rights in the US. We can see that about, we only have to think a little bit to realize that we can see those examples, but they don't fit the narrative that we like to tell. We like to have, in the UK and I think in the US, International Women's Day is every March, and we have this moment of celebration and being proud of ourselves and our achievements. And it's really great to stop and take stock, but we have to make sure that we're taking stock of the right things. And so, one of the stats that I found really interesting, and I've made a note of some bits from the book that I think are useful. So, I'm going to read out a little bit
Absolutely.
just for your viewers. One of the stats that I found interesting, and it is focused on the UK because that's where I'm based.
Hmm.
It pointed out that in 2023, it was found that instead of closing, the gender pay gap for higher educated mothers, which means those mothers who have post-school education, had widened since the 1970s. So the pay gap for working mothers is bigger in 2023 than it was in the 1970s, with working mothers earning only 69% of working fathers' wages. And this means that women today are paying a motherhood penalty that is larger than it was 45 years ago in 1978. And because in 1978, women earned about 72% of the wages of their male parent counterparts. And so researchers have argued that rather than any closing of the gender pay gap being due to societal progress, they argue that the gap closing, if it has, is largely being driven by economic factors like the minimum wage falling and the wages for less educated men falling. So instead of seeing women coming up, being better compensated and closing that gap, what we've seen is the male baseline drop to be
Mm.
closer to that female range. And we've called that progress. We've said that gap has closed, but we haven't said in which way it's closed. And so we get all of these stats, and that's just one example, and that's just UK based. But we get all of these stats, and we're able to turn them into positive stories. We're able to frame them in terms of progress. But when we don't look at, well, what are the actual numbers? How have they closed? What has been the real world experience for people? We don't get to tell the real stories. And I think that's part of the difficulty. We love this narrative of progress, but we haven't checked that it's still true.
Right. And I think the problem itself is quite complex. What we
Mm,
see on the surface, which is we see many more female leaders now. Women are supposedly more educated statistically in the United
mhm,
States than men. And we're seeing the uprise in masculinity crisis, where
yeah,
men are feeling that they're not seen, meaning the power has shifted to women. I think this is a narrative of our society right now. So I don't want to dismiss the pain that younger male are facing right now, but it almost seems like there are only certain people can be in power. So if we make women happier, men can't be happy. It seems that there's a scarcity and that we are paying women more attention, and that's at the expense of men's rights, which is why I think your book is so important during this time, because it addresses the complexity of this issue. The statistics you talked about, and you talk about in your book, the broken rung. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it helps us see systemically how women are at a disadvantage in the very beginning.
Absolutely. But just to come back to one point that you made, I think it is important and it is interesting to think about the change in masculinity and what that looks like and what that expectation is and how that's demonstrated and lived. But I don't think progress is at the expense of men's rights. I think it's at the expense of a historical perception of a man's right to lead, a man's right to be the only person in power. But I don't think that's men's rights in the same way as when we talk about women's rights. When we're talking about women's rights, generally we're talking about access to healthcare and to education and to safety. And I don't think we're sacrificing any of those things for men when we talk about women taking on better places in society. But I do think we're talking about a change to a perceived positioning. So I don't think we're losing men's rights.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's the perception of it. And when you're not seeing the complexity of the issue, I think it's very easy for people to see the statistics and say, hey, look, male depression's on the rise and all of that. So there's a causality. It's because of women has gotten more power. But I think it's easy to perceive it or interpret that way. But in actuality, just like you said, perhaps it's not as simple that men, or traditionally white male, have been in power for so long that the fact that they're no longer occupy or monopolize the leadership position seems like a huge sacrifice or a huge loss for them.
I think that's really well articulated. It's not a loss of rights, but it's a loss of absolute power. And that feels like a loss when that's what you're used to, when that's what you've been taught and socialized to expect and to believe is like you said, you're right. But to come back to your question about the broken rung. So the broken rung really is talking about, imagine your career as a ladder. And a ladder is obviously made up of different rungs. And the broken rung talks about women's progression and the difficulties that they have of climbing that ladder, because from the very beginning, those rungs seem to be either missing or broken. And so it really refers to the challenges that women face at the very beginnings of their careers. So from the very first step of our working lives, there is already, and I will say that my stats and the things that I write about are US and UK based, because that's where the majority of my research comes from, and that's where my lived experience comes from. So I'm going to say that's going to be the framing of pretty much everything that I'm talking about today. But when we look at those really first entry level steps into our working lives, we can see that in the US, women make up 57% of college level graduates. But despite that, fewer women are hired into entry level roles than men. So we have 57%, the majority of grads are women, but they're not the majority of people who are even getting those first graduate jobs. And then when we look at taking your first step from that first graduate job to your first leadership role, your first promotion, your first step into management, your first step up that ladder of your career, we can see that for every 100 men that are promoted, only 87 women are promoted in that same cohort. So we start off with 57% of graduates being women, and we narrow that pool into a smaller group of women who are actually given those jobs. Then of that existing pool, of 100 men that are taken out, only 87 women are taken out and upwards. And so we already have a diminished pool artificially through our hiring practices. And then we continue to diminish that pool of women up through promotions. And so that rung is broken. That very first step is broken. It takes longer, it's more difficult. Some women never manage to even get beyond that first rung. And so the broken ladder, that broken rung, really plays when we see people saying, well, I can't hire another woman for my board. I can't hire another senior woman because the pipeline isn't there, that pool isn't there, that talent isn't there to choose from. One, I always say that's not true. There are so many talented people. You're just not looking in the right place or not saying the right things to be attractive to them or whatever it is. But also that group has been made smaller, and that's been made artificially smaller by our choices about who to employ and then who to bring up that ladder alongside us.
That's a great point that you make. It's artificially made, this leaky pipeline, this broken run, right? There were studies, and I can't remember names of studies, of Jennifer versus John on a resume, right? There were so many different studies where the resume is exactly the same, but you put Jennifer on it versus John on it and have people rate the resume, and John always come off as a better candidate. And so I think that's what you're saying, because we do have that perception, right? Mm-hmm. We do, I think in our unconscious mind, we have that presumption that men are better at certain things, right? This is our collective consciousness. And so when we talk about how hiring based on meritocracy has problems, I think it's great that you mentioned two. One is, yes, this is a leaky pipeline. This is a broken run, and there are fewer candidates, and it's for artificial reasons. And the other part that I really want to share with you, the story, is that it's really a matter of perception. They are candidates out there. You're looking at the right places. So in my organization, like Women on Board, once we were talking to this men about why certain companies should hire more women on their boards, and they said, well, why should we do that and lower our standard? We hire based on meritocracy. And right away, it's saying, we asked you to hire more women. Why do you automatically assume we're asking to lower your standard? It's not the same question, but it's perceived that way. So I wanted to share with you that story because it really did happen. And these are very educated people that say these things. So the presumption is deep in our consciousness.
Absolutely. So a lot of my work focuses on race. This particular book, which looks different where you are,
Yes.
Focuses really primarily on gender. But my previous two books really focus on race. And I think it's very similar to the conversation that we have around privilege when it comes to race. When we say to people, you have had these privileges, the general response is very defensive, it's very sort of blocking, it's very like, I have, how can I have? I have worked hard and I have earned everything that I have got. And if you worked just as hard, you would have just as much. And I think in the work that I've done, it's become clear that it's really easy to see where you have had roadblocks. It's really easy to see where there has been, a flooded road or a tree in your way or something that means you have to either stop where you are or work really hard to overcome something. But it's much harder to see where you haven't had any roadblocks. It's just a normal journey. You don't notice anything, nothing is unusual. And so when we say to people, you've had privilege, they think, well, I haven't. I've had difficulties, and they can't see that they're not always the same. They can't see that they might be fewer, or they might have assistance to overcome them, or they might have, benefits from society, like all of these things. And I think it's the same when we talk about gender, and we talk about that idea of meritocracy, because it's really comforting, right? It's really comforting to say, I got here because I worked really hard. And I think that's like, I'm not American, but I feel like that's essentially the American dream, right? You can start anywhere, and if you work hard enough and if you're talented enough, you can get anywhere. And that's really great for a capitalist society to believe, because one, it means you have to work hard. It means that you have to, invest your time and energy and body into work, which is really beneficial for a capitalistic society. But it's also really great for individualistic societies, because society doesn't, in that context, owe you anything. And you don't owe society anything. You are just an individual, and you can work as hard as you can. And if you do work hard, that skill, that competency, and that effort will be rewarded and you will go far. And anyone who hasn't got as far as you don't need to feel sorry for them. You don't need to help them. You don't owe them anything because they should just work harder. You worked harder. Why can't they? And so I think that's a really powerful message for society. If the culture that you live in wants you to be a really useful worker, wants you to be a really productive cog in a wheel. And that means that I think that idea of meritocracy is really comforting if you are somebody who has what we perceive as success. If you are someone who has what we perceive as security and money and prestige and position, you just say, well, yeah, I got here, I earned it, and you could too. And so I think the idea of meritocracy is really prized and held preciously by people who are, in terms of like race language, we would say people who are privileged, because if you don't hold on to that idea of meritocracy, then you start having to question the system. And that's a much less comfortable position to be in.
Absolutely. It's absolutely uncomfortable. And that's what I think this book it's so necessary right now because still so many people aren't seeing how the level of playing field is not equal, right?
Mhm.
I think you talk about the concept of privilege and it triggers anger response because there are so many poor, right? People who we think are privileged, they believe they worked really hard because they were poor or they had to really fight and overcome some challenges. So I think the word privilege itself, it sounded like you have something more, but they don't feel like they have something more. It's just everybody else had something less.
Yeah.
But the word privilege made it sound like I'm telling you, you had more than other people, like you were more spoiled. And I think that triggers a response. And I remember thinking about that in graduate school. We talk about the walk of privilege. It's you really don't think about that. Have you heard of that exercise?
No.
I think most of us broke down in the end. We were asked to stand in one straight line, and there were questions like, did you have to pay off your college loans? Or did you have to borrow money in order to go to school? Did you ever worry that because of your race, you can't get into a cab? You can't hail a cab. So every time the answer is yes, then take a step back. And if you didn't have to worry about that, you can stay still. Or were your parents ever divorced? Have you ever had discrimination? Or just there are a lot of questions. And so we sort of closed our eyes when we were walking or listening to the questions. And when you finally open up your eyes, you realize you are very far from a lot of people. I was in school in the United States. There was another Asian girl. We obviously started on the same line, but then I just saw how privileged I was. She was way behind. You know, she had to pay her student loan. She had to work for every penny. She had to pay off family debt. That's something that we don't think about when we're supposedly privileged because you don't think about what you already have. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
It's really hard to see where you haven't had to struggle. And I think that's the difficulty. Like you can see where those roadblocks are, but if you haven't had them, it's hard to imagine anyone else has. It's hard to imagine that that's their context and that's their struggle. And even if you can see it or you know it academically, it's hard again to then think, well, how does this relate to my life in relation to someone who has had these difficulties? What does that mean? I think, yeah, the idea of privilege can feel really jarring to people. But I think when you frame privilege as it's just the areas where you haven't had to struggle, then I think it starts to become a lot easier.
yeah, absolutely. So, coming back to the glass cliff, we talk
Mm.
about women being put in that position and why it might be damaging for them or why it might be a dangerous place to be. You address this in this book, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more because when we see these opportunities given to those women, a lot of times the response is like, look, look what they're doing. They're changing. They're launching their diversity initiative. They're making huge progress by appointing this female leader during this crisis to lead. But there are a lot of complications or challenges that come with that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the beginning, we were talking about some of the reasons that women get appointed during these moments of crisis. And one of them was this idea of soft skills. You have a group of people, they're feeling low, we bring someone in, she'd like their mum, she makes them feel better. Dun dun dun, we're all happy. But another reason that women are often brought in during these moments of crisis is that signal that you've just mentioned. So businesses are able to claim like almost cultural kudos. They're able to say, look how progressive we are. Look what a good and inclusive and modern and forward-thinking business we are. We've brought in a woman to lead. Like, how can we be doing anything wrong? And so you could argue that there is a sort of tactical benefit for a business in bringing in a woman in a moment like this. Because if you are in a moment of crisis, if you are having stock market difficulties, profitability issues, if you're having some kind of reputational crisis, it can be quite good to bring in a woman and say, look, we're taking things in a whole new direction. How can we be bad? But what we don't recognize when we're doing that is the glass cliff recognizes that part of the thinking behind that, whether consciously or unconsciously, is that women are viewed as more disposable in business. Women are viewed as more expendable. And that means that in these moments of crisis, as well as being able to be mother, and as well as being able to be that sort of cultural, look how good we are, they also make really good scapegoats. And that's one of the dangers of the glass cliff for women who take on these roles. Because if a female leader is brought into a business and she makes everyone feel better, and the business gets this halo effect from having brought in this underrepresented leader, if she's not able to immediately solve all of the problems that the business is facing, and this, let's remember, is generally problems that were established before she took on this leadership position, these issues that she's inherited, then it's really easy for the business to blame her for those issues. It's really easy for the business to say, well, we all know we've been having a really hard time, and we brought in Sophie. And unfortunately, those issues haven't finished. And so Sophie will now be leaving the business. And we have this perception that the leader and the issues become the same and they can be got rid of. And then what happens, generally speaking, in glass cliff scenarios is that underrepresented leader is normally replaced by someone who is both white and male. And that's known as the savior effect. And that just means a business can say, look, we tried something, it didn't work, and we got rid of her. And so now we're back to business as usual. We're back in a safe pair of hands. And I'm not saying this is conscious. I'm not saying that, there's a group of white men in a boardroom around a table being like, okay, we're going to sacrifice a woman now. I don't think that's what's happening. But I think subconsciously, I think even if it's not intentional, that does seem to be what the reality is.
Yeah. This is basically by association or pairing psychology, right? So you associate our business as bad. So we want to dissociate that. We find a woman, someone from a marginalized group. We now associate this woman as bad. You're no longer associating company as bad, but this woman is bad. Now she's a scapegoat. And so we get rid of the problem and then go back to normal. Right. Yeah. It is sort of a storyline that we are here over and over again. And there are some success stories where women have asked to lead in these situations and really have turned things around. Case in point, I think one person that comes to mind is the CEO of AMD, Lisa Su, right now. But those cases are rare. Can we talk about why that is? And why is that when we ask women to step in, they're not given as much resources as the savior later on that comes in will get? I mean, case in point, I think Theresa May, right? Almost the day that she became the prime minister, I think we all sort of knew around the globe, this isn't going to last very long. because the way the media had portrayed her, she doesn't really know what she's doing, is really the way, at least the news I saw from Asia, is how they portrayed her. Now, then you're thinking, well, if you don't think she knows what she's doing, why are you putting her in that position to begin with? It's a puzzling thing. But do you think that's done on purpose? That the resources have always been there. It's just when this marginalized person, when this woman takes over, we're not going to give it to her because we do eventually want to scapegoat her? Or do you think there are other reasons at play?
It's an interesting question. And I'm sure that there's not a singular answer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure in different circumstances, in different businesses, in different countries, in different types of organization, because we're talking about a really wide range of organizations, right? We're talking about businesses, we're talking about boardrooms, we're also talking about governments and, political leadership. And we see the glass cliff also playing out in like sports teams and like all sorts of things. It's really wide and varied. And I think we probably do it a disservice by imagining that there's a singular narrative every time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's much easier if there could be. But I think if we take, I want to go back to saying that not every woman who takes on a leadership position is likely to face the glass cliff. And I really want to be clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
And this will come back to the answer about resources and investment and all of that type of thing. But I want to go through some of the things that have to happen for you to face a glass cliff scenario, because I think that's probably also quite encouraging. Because one, we can say this isn't something that is biological. It's not that women can't lead, and so every woman who takes on a leadership position will fall foul of this at all. And it also gives people who might be listening to this like a little checkbox, like, okay, are the situations that I'm in linking up to this? So the first thing, in order to be a woman who is likely to take on a glass cliff scenario, which is in order to be a woman who is taking on a role where you're likely to be pushed over the edge of a glass cliff eventually, you have to be a first. So if you are in a business that already has a good history of female leadership being successful, it's really unlikely that you're going to face a glass cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Because to face a glass cliff, there needs to be an idea of novelty around you. There needs to be an idea of you being someone other than the norm. And that will come back when we talk about this idea of disinvesting and taking away resource. So if there's already a proven history of successful female leadership in the business or organization that you are in, or you are thinking about taking on a position in, then you probably are not going to face the glass cliff, because that is really like a pioneer's tax, like a novelty issue.
That's a great point. So sorry, just to stop you there. That's why representation, it's so important. You got to have a first, right? You got to have a first success story, so then the rest can follow, right?
Exactly.
We got to make room for that first to thrive. Yeah, sorry,
Exactly.
I interrupted you. Yeah.
No, but it's a really valid point. The next thing that has to happen is there has to be a perception of risk. And I don't mean a perception of risk on your side. I mean a perception of risk on the side of the people who are bringing you into that space. So there has to be this idea, again, that you are a novelty, that you are something that we've never tried before. And so whether you are a Black man or an Asian man or any woman, if you haven't been represented in that space before, there has to be a perception that, okay, we're trying something different here and it might not work. And again, that comes back to that sort of disinvestment. There needs to be a feeling that women are disposable. And again, that comes from this position of being the first. So there needs to be this feeling that you are from a group that are disposable. So it could go well, but if it doesn't, saving the business is what's important. You as an individual are not the most important thing here.
Mm-hmm.
You also, to face the glass cliff, need to be joining a business or joining that role in the business that's already been in a prolonged period of crisis. So if you join a business that is on the up and has always been on the up, and you are just taking it to its next phase, you're unlikely to face the glass cliff. But what we
Mm.
see generally is we see, Elon Musk tweeting, I will step down as the CEO of Twitter as soon as I find someone who is stupid enough to take on the role. That is, I think, a word for word quote of his. 2 weeks later, Linda Yaccarino, she's hired. She's the first CEO of that business. That business is in trouble before she arrives. It has reputational hits because of Elon Musk. It has financial hits. She's coming in to take on an already leaking boat.
Mm.
And the final factor that's at play is you have to have a lack of support. And that's what we're talking about, this disinvestment. And the difficulty with that final point is you often don't know it until you're in it. And so you join a business and you have this cohort of other senior managers, of other senior leaders, and they're going to be your closest cohort. If you're the CEO, if you're head of the board, if you're whatever, those are the people who are going to be working most closely with you. So when we look at representation at different business levels, we can see that, and I'm just going from my mind, so these stats might be marginally wrong, but they will be correct largely.
Yeah.
White men in US workplaces start at about 30% representation at those most junior entry-level roles. By the time we look to the C-suite, that representation has ballooned to over 60%. So over 60% of senior leaders in US businesses are white men. And what's interesting about that stat is they are the only group whose representation grows as you become more senior, to go back to that broken rung conversation. Every single other demographic group in the US shrinks as they become more senior. Women, there are more entry-level women than there are senior women. There are more entry-level Asian men than there are senior Asian men, but there are more senior white men than there are that representation grows as a percentage of the overall cohort. And so you really have this group of people, white and male, who are very used to seeing themselves and people who look like themselves being rewarded and being told that they are the natural leaders of spaces, of industries, of political parties, of whatever that is. And so when we bring in someone who doesn't match them in both of those demographic markers, what we see is a disinvestment, that disinvestment that we're talking about. And so I know we've spoken a lot about that representation and how we need to see it to be it and all of these things. In reality, what happens all too often is when a underrepresented leader takes on those most senior levels in business, head of the board, CEO, what we see is there's research that has shown that that closest cohort of disproportionately white men, they disinvest from the business when they don't have someone who they feel represents them, because they feel like, and I was trying to, I talked about this in my TED talk, but I did that 4 years ago. So let me try to remember. They feel less personally represented by the business. And so they feel less personally able to invest in that business. So let's go into a scenario where business is already in trouble, because that's one of the checkpoints that we know we need for a glass cliff appointment. A business is already in trouble, and it has been for a prolonged period. And a business has never had a female leader before. So we bring in this female leader to a business that's already in trouble. And instead of rallying behind and supporting and, endorsing and pushing through the changes and ideas and strategies that this new leader has, we find that closest cohort instead disinvests from her. They question her, they challenge her, they try to make some space between themselves and her. And that's because we have this thing that we've already talked about, of this perception of risk, of this perception of who can and should be a leader and how successful they're going to be. And if you have someone who doesn't meet that ideal of a leader visually, characteristically, demographically, that we've become so used to, they become seen as a risk. And if someone comes into a business and they seem like a risk, I don't want to associate myself with that person. I want to put some space between myself and that person, especially if I'm in this individualistic, capitalistic society that says that my success is just down to me. Why would I then pin my colours to the flag of this person who I think is likely to fail? And so because we think she's likely to fail, we treat her like she's going to fail. We don't give her that same resource, that same support, that she's coming into an already difficult situation and we're making it more difficult. We're not giving her that resource from that closest cohort level. And then what we find often from the board above this person is women are given much, much, much shorter times to succeed or fail. So that timeline becomes shrunk. So she hasn't got that support that she needs to rely on, and she hasn't got the time to build that support before the board says, well, we're not happy with what's going on here. We're going to need to make some changes. It's a really terrible situation, right? You've been brought in to make a change, but the people who you need to work with, because even the best and most amazing leader is not going to make full transformational change single-handedly. She needs the team that are working in this business to be part of that. They're not supporting her. And then the people above her are saying, well, we want to change much faster than this, and you're not delivering that. So we've got these real two tensions. And the final thing that I will say is, I really thought this idea of representation was going to be key when I first started doing this work. And I first started doing this work when I was writing my second book, which is about race. And I wanted to say, well, what happens when you do have a leader who is both Black and female? Is that great for the people coming up, the women, the Black women coming up under her? And the answer is no, unfortunately, all too often. And I really wanted it to be yes. And I was so devastated that it was no. But it does seem to be no, because that layer of white male senior leadership who disinvest, and I will say the research shows that they self-report disinvesting. These men are going in to speak to a researcher and saying, I'm not supporting this person, which realistically, you should, like, that should be on your deathbed. You shouldn't just be, saying to someone who comes into the business, yeah, I'm not helping. But they also say that they are disinvesting from people who are like that leader, who are more junior than them. So if I am someone who holds both Blackness and womanness, for example, or, womanness and queerness, or whatever it is, some of the important demographic markers that make me me, if there are people who are more junior that also seem to match those demographic markers, we also see that layer of leadership disinvesting support from them. So we see them not managing them as effectively. We see them not mentoring. We see them not acting as sponsors. We see them not putting people forward for opportunities. And so in that way, I think it's really important, but really sad to know that the glass cliff bites twice, because it pushes that leader further and further towards the edge of her cliff, because she's not getting that support, she's not getting that time, she's not getting that investment. But also those more junior people who could be that next generation of underrepresented leaders are also not getting that support or time or investment, while the rest of their teams continue to be invested in. And that was a really long answer, sorry.
Oh, no, that's just sounds horrible, because not only are you not getting the support from your boss, the board, because you're not giving the grace to fail as much. You're also not getting the support from your peers or your subordinates. And at the same time, you're sort of putting people who are like you in danger unintentionally, because people's disdain towards you are transferred to these group of people. Just that being the representation, so much pressure, right? Everyone's looking at you like you're the only Black women leader we've had, so you better succeed. And I remember, this is very funny, in that show, the one that I was talking about, Running Points, when she found out she was taking over the CEO position, her secretary or her best friend told her, well, you can't fail. Men can fail, but you cannot, right?
Yeah.
She had a quote, I forgot what it was, but essentially it's like, you can't fail because you don't have that grace period. You have to succeed right away because all eyes are on you. No, it just sounds like it's such a horrible position that these women or these marginalized leaders are in. However, we still see people jumping into that position. And I have to be honest, I would as well, because without that, all of that, I may not get a chance, right? Being me, I got to jump on that. So you see a lot of people, a lot of women still wanting that position because that might be the only chance they've got. So now that we understand how difficult it is, the dynamics, the complexity of the dynamics for people who are about to go into that position, what can we tell them based on what we've learned from your data, from all that you've researched? Are there any examples of women who were able to somehow not fall, even when the push is there?
Yeah, there are, happily. And so one of the things that I struggled with and had lots of conversations with my editor about in the sort of prelude to the book coming out in the UK was the fact that the glass cliff simply does not exist everywhere. And I think my editor saw that as a challenge, and I see that as a really positive thing. If the glass cliff existed everywhere, then there would be something inherent to womanness that meant that whenever we are, wherever we are, if we are in these positions, they go like this. But Turkey is one of the examples of where research has been done and the glass cliff can't be found. And I think that's really positive because there's something about the way that we perceive women and we've set up business in that country that means that it's not happening. And that means that we can learn from that. That means that there's an opportunity. That means that there is nothing inherent or biological about these issues. These are societal issues. They're due to how we've set up our societies, how we've set up our workplaces, how we view women, what expectations we have of them. So I think the first thing to know is it's not a done deal. It's not definitely going to happen.
So good to hear.
Absolutely. I think otherwise it's a really sad book, right?
Yeah. So it does bring hope. It does bring hope. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the next thing to know is you have to hit those checkpoints that we talked about, being the first, being a novelty, having that disinvestment. All of those things need to happen for it to be a glass cliff scenario. So there are loads of women who take on scenarios of really good, strong, high level, visible leadership who don't face the glass cliff. And that's great. But if you are in a position where you are there and, like you say, those conditions are met and there is a push, then there are some things that we can do. The first thing that we can do is we can be aware of it. So like you're saying, this idea of women being put in these positions, it pops up in pop culture. I haven't seen Succession, but I'm told it's the storyline in Succession. I think it's in The Office, not The Office, The Chair with Sandra Oh. I think she's like, takes on a leadership position within a university and has this play out. I should have watched more TV shows that are about this, but I find I just don't want to muddy like what's real and what's fiction.
Right, of course.
And you talking about running points, it sounds like that's another clear example. So we see this idea in pop culture, but we don't have, or we haven't had the word for it. And so because we are largely in individualistic societies, what we get, the message is, well, she wasn't good enough. We don't get the message of, here are the societal, systemic, social factors that have gone into making that an untenable position for her. We just say she wasn't good enough, she wasn't smart enough, she wasn't talented enough, she didn't work hard enough. So I think having that language is really helpful, because when I first started talking about this, I would go to businesses or I'd do talks and people would come up and say, I had no idea this was a thing, but this has happened to me. And it took me years of talking about it to realize, okay, this is a really shared experience that there's no language behind. And so I think having the language is really important because it allows us to see that it's not an individual personal failing. It's a set of circumstances that are outside of us that we have stepped into. And as you say, often for good reason. If you don't feel like you're going to get offered a different, more secure opportunity to take on a leadership position, and a leadership position is what you want, you can walk into a glass cliff scenario knowing that that's what it is. And that is still better than walking into it being completely unaware. So I'd say understand the phenomenon, understand the factors that lead to it. That's really important. And then as a like public example of someone who stepped into what could be a glass cliff scenario but avoided it, in the book I talk about Mary Barra, and she took on the role of the head of General Motors. And just after she took on that role, that business fell apart. Like they had really major mechanical issues with their cars, people died, there had to be major recalls, and it turned out that there were major problems within the manufacturing processes. And
Before she became the leader.
before she became exactly. So this all came to like a public head maybe 2 weeks after she'd stepped into the role. And although that is awful and all absolutely like I don't want to diminish people's loss of life, like unthinkably bad.
Right.
What I think saved Mary Barra in that scenario was she was so new in that role. All of these historic problems, they were big enough, they'd been going on for long enough, and the results were bad enough that we were able to immediately all know, well, she hasn't caused this in the 2 weeks that she's been there.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of doing what a lot of people do and becoming a scapegoat or becoming like a silent face of this problem, she stood up and she said, we have done something really bad here. And we have to take responsibility for that. And we have to change it. And here's what we're doing. And I think that standing up and being the public face of it, with the knowledge that it had not been, she had not been in role long enough to be blamed for it, is probably what was really helpful for her. But like we've also seen in the last year or so, Stephanie Pope step into the role of the first female CEO of Boeing. Boeing not having a good moment. And when she stepped in, it was when we were having those constant news reports about airline failures.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting to see that she stepped into that role in that moment. And I don't think we've really heard from her since. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. Will we, when the next thing goes wrong, say it's her fault? Because now she's been there for a period, or will we say she inherited these issues? I don't know yet, but it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. But yeah, coming in, saying these are the problems that were here before I arrived, and here's what I'm going to do about it, can be really helpful, but it kind of needs to be paired with this big public fallout, which isn't something that you'd want to manufacture if you were a female taking on this role.
No, absolutely not. But you know what I thought? Now that the book is out and now that people are made aware of the biases and the systemic problem, so if all the boxes are checked and if I were in that position, I could very easily just say, everyone, look, I know the challenges I'm going to have because you may not give me enough grace period, but here's what I need from all of you for us to make this work. And here are all the statistics. And you might not want to invest. You might think that I'm not here for the long haul, but let's try to change it. Like, I think it's great that there's a book written about it. And so we can say, like you said, we have the language, we have the data. We know what's going to happen. So let's rewrite the script, right? So I think it's so great that you have this out. And so we can start talking about it.
Thank you. And that was really my intention from going around and talking to people and realizing that all of these women, and it was women I was speaking to in these contexts, realizing that all of these women thought that they had done something wrong, thought that they hadn't been ready enough or good enough or smart enough. And being able to say, well, do you know about these stats? Do you know about this term? Has been just the most amazing thing. And so what happens now that the book is out is people I don't even know message me on Instagram when they see something in the news and they're like, I've spotted the next glass cliff. So when Kamala Harris got the Democratic nomination, I got a call from the New York Times being like, do you think this is a thing? And I was like, yep, I think this is a thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
At the moment, the Director General of the BBC has just stepped down in the UK. everyone who might replace him is a woman. And there's been loads of articles about, oh, this is great, finally a woman. But articles have started coming out this weekend of being, is this setting somebody up for the glass cliff?
Yeah.
And that narrative happened with Stephanie Pope at Boeing. It happened with the new Archbishop of Canterbury in the UK. Like, what's interesting is this is not a new term. Researchers first came up with this term and this wording back in 2005. This isn't a new discovery, but it's something that hasn't really got into the public consciousness in the same way as like the glass ceiling. And so I'm really, really happy that this word, this term, this phrase, this phenomenon has started to be recognized by more people, because I think the more we know, the better we can do. And the more we can stop saying this individual woman wasn't good enough, and we can say from the very beginning, oh, isn't it weird that they're only talking to women for these roles now? Then we can reframe how we view it as well. And, when we talked about that support and that disinvestment, support doesn't just come from your colleagues. That's really important support. But support is also, if you're a public figure, from the public and from, your community and all sorts of people. And so if we can recognize these issues, and if we can do something to step in to bridge that support gap for these women, even if we don't know them, even if we can just start telling what feels like a truer story about the circumstances that they're stepping into, then maybe we can change the narratives that we tell about women and what they're suitable for and where they can be successful and what that looks like.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. I think the lesson we can take from this, it's not only just looking at women or marginalized group, but just thinking of self and how we a lot of times judge ourselves based on the outcome, but not really seeing the context of the resources that we were given, of where we've started, whether or not it was an equal playing field and whatnot. So I'm teaching a class on organizational psychology and teaching that to how to apply that into running or really managing your lives. And I think this book is a testament to that. Like all these women who thought they weren't good enough, they're not looking at the resources that were given, the situation, the context. And we're not really giving them that grace either. So when we judge someone else or judge ourselves, it's a reminder we need to look at the context, look at the system that they're in and what we can learn from that. And once we can see the system, we might be able to help ourselves or help others.
Completely agree. And if I could just add one final thing to that.
Absolutely.
Is I think we also need to look at what we think of as success. So if you take on a role and you can see, even from the outside, that this role has a high chance of falling victim to the glass cliff, like you said, you might still take on that role. I would probably still take on that role, because we need to normalize that things don't have to last forever to be a success. Like, did you want a C-level title and you finally got one? Great. If it lasted just for a couple of years, fine. If that was something that you wanted, great. Did you do something that made things better for people who are going to come after you? That feels like a success. Did you lead in a way that stayed true to your values and to the things that you wanted to promote and put into the world? That feels like a success. Did you go into a role knowing that it might be difficult and that you might not be in it forever, but you needed X amount of money to send your child to college and you got it? That feels like a success. Like, we don't have to, it doesn't to me feel like a success necessarily to have a job and to do that job for 30 years and to be tired and to never see my family and to have to spend all of my time just working. That doesn't feel like a success for me. But going into something with your eyes open, knowing what you want from it, and being able to frame those things as successes, even if it doesn't last forever, that can be a success if that is what you wanted it to be.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great point. Redefining success, not necessarily in the traditional sense, but just the goal that you set for yourself. You could just manage this transition well, and that could be a great success, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that final point. We all need to look at how we define success. And if that definition fits us, fits the situation, fits the context, versus the same definition of success for everyone, every time. Well,
Absolutely.
thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie, for coming onto my channel. The Glass Cliff, you can find it in bookstores, online bookstores everywhere, now in Chinese. Thank you.
Thank you so much.